Hi all. Today let's try to learn about Truststore and Keystore and the significance in Mulesoft. I have pasted the link to this blog in the description as well. Please do check it out. Let's start with a simple explanation of what is Truststore. A Truststore is something which checks the trustworthiness of other, and on the other hand, Keystore is something which proves its own identity. Let's take a simple example to understand it much better. Suppose that you are hosting a party at your home and you have a list of guests that are invited. Now, you hand over that list to a security guard. As the list contains only the name of people who has the invitation to the party, that list acts like a trustee. And on the other hand, you are the owner of the house and you have your own identity. That means you are legally authorized to host the party. This ID, what you have, is the keystore. Coming back to the explanation, a trustee is something which checks the trustworthiness of other, and keystore is something which proves its own identity. Now let's take few more examples to understand the concept in much more depth. Say for example, Mulesoft have to connect with an endpoint to get some data. Let's take this endpoint as an example. Here if you check, the protocol is HTTPS. And let's check the certificates as well. We can see there are 3 certificates in here. The top one is the root certificate, the bottom one is the end entity certificate, and the middle one is the intermediate certificate. Intermediate certificate connects the root certificate with end entity certificate. Now, what certificate serves what purpose is being explained here as well. Maybe you can pause the video and have a look. Coming back to our screen, to take an example to understand how this chain of trust is being established. Let's take an example of a school system. Consider the root certificate as a principal, intermediate certificate as a supervisor, and the end entity certificate as a teacher. Now you goes to a school to meet a teacher. A teacher comes to you. Now you cannot trust the teacher if she is the legit teacher or not, she is working in the school or not. You can maybe trust her with her ID card or her badge number or something like that, but that won't give you the level of trust that you need. So what you will do, you will go to the supervisor, which is the intermediate certificate. Now you will ask the supervisor if this teacher is working in your school or not. Now, why will you trust the supervisor? Because the supervisor is reporting to the principal. And principal, being the highest level of trust in the school, you can trust the words of supervisor. As a result, you can trust the words of a teacher. Because this is how the trust is built. Principal trusts supervisor, supervisor trusts teacher. So now you can trust the teacher. So this is how the trust builds to the top level. Now, for Mulesoft to connect with this endpoint, you will have to create a truststore using the root certificate. The step-by-step guide of creating a truststore is mentioned over here. You can follow the steps and make truststore for any endpoint. Now, as we have covered the basics of Keystore, Truststore, and the certificates, we can now dive deep into more functional examples. And here you will understand the key difference between Truststore and Keystore and what are the significance of this in any SSL handshake. Now let's take a very simple integration as an example, where we have to fetch some data from the target via Mulesoft. Consider Postman as a client and Mulesoft as a middleware, where Mulesoft is exposing an endpoint for Postman to hit it. Say like this is the endpoint which Mulesoft has been exposed. Now, Postman will be hitting this endpoint. As Postman is hitting the endpoint, Postman is the client. And the endpoint is exposed by Mulesoft, hence this Mulesoft will be the server. As I mentioned earlier, server will always authenticate itself to the client, and client will verify its trustworthiness. As server will authenticate itself, it will be using Keystore. And as client will be the one who will be checking the level of trustworthiness of the server, client will be using a Truststore. Now let's go to our studio and check how it works. Now let's come to Endpoint Studio. As we are exposing an endpoint, we will be using a listener. And inside listener, we will be configuring the Keystore. Always remember that we will be using HTTPS as the protocol. Now let's go back to our whiteboard and see end to end what happens. Now, Postman will hit Mulesoft endpoint. Mulesoft will send its certificates to Postman. Postman will verify those certificates across the Truststore configured inside Postman for the trustworthiness. Once the trustworthiness is verified, a secured communication channel is being established between Mulesoft and Postman via HTTPS protocol. Now let's see what happens between Mulesoft and the target. Now, target will also be exposing an endpoint for Mulesoft to get or post some data. So now, Mulesoft will be hitting target endpoint. In this case, now Mulesoft will be the client and the target will be the server. Now, as I mentioned earlier, server has to authenticate itself, hence it will be using a Keystore. Now, as client has to verify the Keystore, will be using a Truststore. So here, Mulesoft will be using Truststore and the server will be using a Keystore. Now let's see how it's look like in our studio. So here, as we are connecting with an endpoint, we will be using a request connector. And inside request connector, we will be configuring our Truststore inside TLS context. Now, let's have a very quick recap. When Postman hits Mulesoft, Mulesoft acts like a server and Postman acts like a client. Now, it's always the server which needs to authenticate itself to the client. Hence, server will be configured with a Keystore. And client will be configured with a Truststore. Now, on the other hand, when Mulesoft will hit the target endpoint, target will act like a server and Mulesoft will act like a client. Now, as I said, server will always authenticate itself to the client. Now, this server will be configured with a Keystore and Mulesoft will be configured with a Truststore. Now, if you notice, we have to explicitly configure a Truststore in Mulesoft. But we never have configured a Truststore explicitly in Postman. You know why? I have given the same explanation in my blog. You can check it out from the link in the description. With this, I guess you have learned a few concepts of Keystore and Truststore and how they together work in Mulesoft. There is also another concept called two-way SSL handshake, which is explained in my blog. It is not widely used though, hence I am not explaining it here in this video. Until we meet again, keep learning. Goodbye.